My name is Belinda Harrow, and I'm the permanent collection consultant with Sask Arts. I personally pay respect to the original peoples of the land I call home. As I strive to build strong relationships, the original peoples of the land I call home, I also want to build good relationships with those who now share the lands. I recognize my responsibility to these people, the land, the animals, the plants, and the waters upon which we all rely. So I'm pleased to welcome you to the second webinar of Sask Arts Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Speaker Series. Like many of you, Sask Arts is engaged in work around access and inclusion. Through this series, it's our intention to present speakers who we hope can stimulate all of us in our work to address the complex web of inequities in Saskatchewan and Canadian arts communities. And before I introduce the speaker today, I'd like to take a moment to talk about this Zoom and the seminar so it can be as beneficial as possible to everyone who's watching. Closed captioning is available for this session. To access closed captioning, click on the Live Otter AI button at the top left of your screen. The captioning will open in a different browser window and you can follow along there. Please turn off your microphones and video. I don't think you actually have access, but if you do, please turn those off because they can be a distraction. During the presentation, you're welcome to put in questions, either directly to me in private message and I'll read them after the talk, or you can type them into the chat and we'll get to as many as possible. And as you know, we will be recording today's session, make it available through Sask Arts website in case you want to recommend it to colleagues or you get a phone call you have to take in the middle of this presentation. Jeff is going to be sending everyone who's attending today an email with the link once it's up on our website, so you won't have to go searching for that. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Tarah Hogue. Tarah is the inaugural Indigenous Arts Curator at the Reme Modern, a role she began in the fall of 2020. Her most recent exhibition there was entitled An Apology, a Pill, a Ritual, a Resistance. She holds an MA in Critical and Curatorial Studies from the University of British Columbia and a BA in Art History from Queen's University. She's held positions at the Vancouver Art Gallery, Grunt Gallery, and the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. Tarah is also the board co-chair of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective and is the founding member of Shushkitu Collective. She's a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, as well as being a settler descendant on her mother's side. Her mom immigrated to Canada from the Netherlands. She was raised on the border between Treaty 6 and 7 territories in Red Deer. I think the arts community feel very lucky to have Tarah working in our province. And at Sask Arts Permanent Collection, we really appreciate that you've included a number of works from our collection, Tarah, in your thoughtfully curated exhibitions, which provides an opportunity for them to be appreciated at the Reme Modern, which is such a beautiful building. So welcome, Tarah, and thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Belinda, and to the entire Sask Arts team for the invitation. I'll just start my screen share. Okay, so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about how equity has informed and shaped my curatorial practice, as well as my experience as an arts worker in museums, as well as with Indigenous led organizations and collectives. So I often think about exhibitions in relation to land acknowledgements, which is really about how the exhibition responds to the Indigenous territories that they happen on. And putting land acknowledgements into action, I see as being part of equity work because, you know, for Indigenous peoples, you can't really talk about equity without talking about the land. Jessie Wente, who is the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts, describes land back as being, quote, about the decision-making power It's about self-determination for our peoples here that should include some access to the territories and resources in a more equitable fashion, and for us to have control over how that actually looks, end quote. The artist and knowledge keeper, Isaac Murdoch, further describes land back as people returning to the land to find, quote, their place in those systems of life, end quote. For me, attending to equity also means attending to the intersections of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, and other social identities that are oppressed within the dominant system. And in curating exhibitions, we can address these disparities on one level, while also imagining and working with others to bring about equitable forms of relation that are non-colonial and non-discriminatory. And I see this as within my own role in museums in particular at this time in my life, being about transforming the harm that these institutions have perpetuated. So these are the sort of lenses through which I'll be talking about some of my curatorial work today, which is of course informed by my lived experience and positionality as a white and Métis woman who has mostly worked on territories not my own. Although I was raised outside of Métis culture because of intergenerational ruptures that many others have similarly experienced, I have been on a journey of reconnection for many years now, and I can confidently tell you where I come from, who my family is, as well as being connected to my living relations. My Métis family comes from Red River, from the historic communities of St. Charles and St. Francois Xavier. Our family names are Hogue, Turcotte, Taylor, Caplet, and Guiboche. And I've also been really grateful to begin connecting with the Métis community here in Saskatoon, mostly through Zoom so far, as a new member of the Gabriel Dumont Local 11. So before moving here to my nation's homeland and to Treaty 6 territory, where I am a humble newcomer, I lived as an uninvited guest on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories in Vancouver for about 13 years. Before I left, my position was as the first and so far only Senior Curatorial Fellow of Indigenous Art at the Vancouver Art Gallery. So part of what I want to do today is to share some resources and some examples that speak to equity in the ways that I've just described, and which I've had the great fortune of learning from. So I'm starting with primary colors. Oh, and one thing, I think when Jeff sends out the link for today's talk, I can include links to some of these resources as well. So I'm starting with primary colors, which is a multi-year initiative that began in 2016 and is led by Chris Creighton-Kelly and France Trepanier. Its main objective is to place Indigenous arts at the center of the Canadian art system, while also asserting that creative practices by artists of color who have roots around the world play a critical role in imagining the futures of Canadian art making. Primary Colors works to decenter the Western world art lens in order to better understand the complexity of Indigenous art forms and those from various communities of color. And that is a quote from the About section of their website. So the Primary Colors website is a great resource that contains a lot of commission texts responding to major issues, as you see here, as well as responses to various programs that they've done over the years. Primary Colors is an equity-seeking initiative in that it seeks to build new pathways in the arts, really, I think, to build a new art system that is not defined by whiteness or by the Western world art lens. And here I think of Sarah Ahmed, who describes whiteness as an absent center against which all otherness is defined. And she argues that academics need to start by recognizing their own complicity in systems of whiteness to better understand their, quote, proximity to the problems we are addressing, end quote. I think this is useful and something that I try to put into practice myself in how I position myself and introduce myself to others, as I did earlier. What Primary Colors does, however, is to recenter the focus on conversations across racialized experiences and cultural knowledges that aren't white, because that produces a very different kind of conversation where we can still attend to how those experiences are shaped by structures of power, but where different kinds of solidarities can be built. And here I am reminded of something that the Sudanese artist and anti-oppression consultant Rania El-Mugammer taught me, which is that getting to know one another is an anti-colonial practice, and that solidarity can look a lot like friendship. Briefly, one of the things that I took away from Primary Colors from my experience of their programs is the importance of knowing our history, because artists and their co-conspirators have been organizing for a long time in the name of equity, and some of these instances are not widely known or accounted for in institutional memory. So the Artist Coalition for Local Color is one such example. The group formed in 1991 in response to the exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery called Fabled Territories, New Asian Photography in Britain. The exhibition was the first of contemporary South Asian art to happen in Vancouver, but in bringing all of these artists from elsewhere, it perpetuated the exclusion of that community in a local context. And the activities of Local Color catalyzed public conversation, as you see from this poster. Also a number of texts that were published in different venues and subsequent programming that happened at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Zul Suleman, who is the founder of Rung magazine and was a member of Local Color, holds the entire archive of this collective and has plans to publish it on Rung magazine, which is a really great online arts magazine in some form in the future. And in the meantime, there is a video of us, the two of us, discussing the local history color on the Vancouver Art Gallery's Vimeo website or on Rung magazine. So I'll send some links for that if you're interested in digging into these kinds of histories of artists organizing. So I attended a gathering that Primary Colors held in 2017 on Lekwungen territory, just outside of Victoria, on Vancouver Island. And that experience directly led to my first exhibition at the VAG, which was called Ayumi Goto and Peter Morin, How Do You Carry the Land? And I will just read the introductory text for you to introduce the project. How do you carry the land? How do you carry the place where you were born, that you may have lost or have been forced to leave? How do you carry lands that you visit or pass through? How do you come to be in relation to the land where you are? When do you carry the land with you? How does the land offer to be carried? How does carrying the land change you, change us? In this space of temporary gathering, Ayumi Goto and Peter Morin are assembling the land through their bodies as performance artists and with invited guests that include their ancestors, mothers, friends, and us. Oh, and this is the introductory text that you would read when you walk into the space. So the us that's being addressed is the visitor in the room. Their collaborative practice builds upon a deep friendship that attends to their respective positions as a Japanese diasporic woman and a Tahltan First Nations man. This means attending to individual and collective histories, trauma, racism, families, genders, extended kinships, cultural knowledge and production, languages, lands, and nations. Their work can be considered as creative assemblages, configurations of being in relation to the world that challenge us to envision ways of building interconnected futures. The exhibition weaves together a selection of Goto and Morin's collective performances along with significant solo projects by both artists. In parallel, the artists inhabit Tahltan Nation knowledge of the circularity of time and the life force of objects, as well as the Japanese Taoist notion of Inyo, that conceptualizes the universe as a circle, wherein contrasting forces are also interconnected and constantly in motion. In performance, Goto and Morin live through past, present, and future moments simultaneously, collapsing time and intensifying presence. Their works are represented here as an enfolding of many moments from which new meanings emerge. A number of other artists have also been commissioned to create work for the exhibition, several of which are activated in or respond to performances occurring over the exhibition's duration. The resulting shifting installation insists on the multiplicity of voices that Goto and Morin's collaborative practice foregrounds. And the title wall ended with a land acknowledgement that read, "The artists and the Vancouver Art Gallery respectfully acknowledge the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations and their ancestors, past, present, and future, who have been carried and in turn have carried these lands for thousands of years. If you find meaning here, return it to the lands you walk upon today." So through the inclusion of a number of additional artists in performances that often responded to the history and particular exclusions reproduced by the Vancouver Art Gallery building, which was a provincial courthouse active during the potlatch ban years, the exhibition sought to open space for forms of relating across difference and to the land itself that are beyond the capacity of the institution to contain. So this is a photo of the opening performance, a photo of Ayumi and Peter in performance in an Emily Carr exhibition. And finally, for this performance, we shut the entire third floor of the museum down during regular open hours so that we could tour our mothers through the exhibition, which is an act meant to honor their knowledge and contributions to the artist practice. We received quite a bit of feedback from visitors to the exhibition who said that they felt that the space had been shifted or changed by this exhibition and its performances, which, considering the really heavy history of that building, felt like no small feat. This is Talal Samkane, CM Bill Williams, and his son Mark at the opening of Lineages and Land Bases, which was my final exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Alongside my curatorial work, I had initiated a cross-departmental Indigenous Relations working group and was advocating and working toward building relations with the host nations, which is how I was introduced to CM. CM is the great-grandnephew of this woman, Sewinchawit Sophie Frank, who is depicted in this small watercolor portrait by Emily Carr. Sophie and Emily were friends for more than 30 years, a relationship that, as Chief Bill tells it, had a profound impact on Carr's understanding of her relationship to the natural world and how she depicted this in her art. So this was a consideration at the center of the exhibition, which compared Salish basketry to the late oil on paper paintings by Carr. So here in the display case, in the center is a basket by Sophie Frank. The basket on the right is by her sister, Monica, who is Chief Bill's grandmother. And the basket on the left is by Marianne August, also from the Squamish Nation. And we only included baskets in the exhibition that were attributed to known makers. So the comparison between these two forms was further informed by the art historian Christina Huno's own visual analysis, where she argues that, quote, "There is a sense in which the better known artist's heavily metaphorical depiction of trees finds a literal counterpart in the basket's coiled arboreal fibers." So here you see the basket by Sophie on the left. So Huno argues that Carr's mature works convey an intensity of feeling and expression of movement and vitality that, quote, "reminds viewers of the unseen lines of force and movement that carry all of existence, including the artist herself, along in its flow," end quote. Huno connects Carr's desire for oneness with the natural world to the web of relatedness that Salish basket makers participate in, suggesting that the process of basket making entwines land, spirit, and skilled creative practice together. Recognizing how we are always already a part of the natural world is a very different understanding than that conveyed in Canadian art in the early to mid 20th century, at the time when Carr was working, and Sophie. Art historians John O'Brien and Peter White argue that landscape functioned, quote, "as a powerful political unifier. It has helped to consolidate the drive toward national sovereignty, as well as to contain prior Indigenous claims to land. Through the fiction of wilderness, a fiction that should not be confused with nature's wild unpredictability or with a condition unique to Canada, quote unquote, empty land was declared to be there for the taking, and then it was mythologized," end quote. So elsewhere in the exhibition, contemporary artworks from the Bag's permanent collection considered this inheritance and its implication for who was included and who was not included in the vision of Canada as expressed in its art history. I want to talk about one particular work, which is Jin Mi Yoon's A Group of 67 from 1997. To produce this work, Jin Mi arranged for 67 members of Vancouver's Korean Canadian community to be individually photographed in two different settings at the Vancouver Art Gallery. In one set of photographs, the sitter is directly back at the camera with Malign Lake Jasper Park by the Group of 7 painter Lauren Harris in the background, and that painting is from 1924. And in the other set of photographs, the sitter has turned their back to the viewer to survey Emily Carr's painting Old Time Coast Village from 1929. Rather than being a kind of straightforward critique of Canadian national identity and its inclusions and exclusions, or a kind of simplistic assertion that these people are Canadian too, I think that the work engages with the pictorial traditions of Canadian landscape painting and the Vancouver Art Gallery as an institution through which those traditions have been disseminated to raise more complex questions in regard to audience. So, what are the perceptions of the people who are viewing this work in relation to community? As the sitters are pictured both as individuals and as a group, and in relation to the site of the Vancouver Art Gallery. So before installing the work, I asked the artist if there was anything we should do to honor the Korean Canadian community and the sitters in the work as part of the institution's responsibility to the work and the community it pictured. A private event was initiated as a result, which was formed around the question, "What am I here?" which often informs Jin Mi's practice, and which she asks of both herself and others in her work. So together we approached Chief Bill Williams, who was an advisor to this exhibition, with the idea, and the event prioritized exchange between youth and elders from the Korean community in Vancouver and from the Squamish community, and included an exhibition tour, food, conversation, and the conversation touched upon experiences of colonization, which are recent and ongoing for both communities. They also shared creation stories and talked about relations to the land, particularly in the context of unceded territories on which Vancouver is built. It was one of the last in-person events we held before the pandemic, and I know that it has catalyzed further relations and work between these two communities, which I very much see in the same light as how Primary Colors described their mandate. But also, Jinmi recently shared a reading with me by Christine Kim, where she writes about Kwan Sing Chen's idea of interreferencing, which I think is an interesting one to share in this context. She describes interreferencing as a deliberate attempt to make visible the complex discourses of colonialism and imperialism that shape relations both within and outside of Asia. And moreover, to insert this messier understanding of Asia into ongoing debates about how settlers of color are seen within settler colonialism. So I think that this idea of interreferencing can help us to think through what are the complexities of those positions that we inhabit as either arrivants, as myself, a mixed Indigenous person, and how we need to really have these complex conversations in order to move towards equity. So, water a break. So, of course, when we talk about equity in the arts, we also have to be aware that the progressive image forwarded by institutions in their programming does not necessarily or rarely does equate to an equitable work culture, and that exhibitions are inevitably limited in what kind of change they can catalyze. Here, I always think about something David Garneau argues, which is that art is unruly, and that artists are unreliable political allies because they resist totalizing projects. He was writing about Indigenous political theory here, but I think that the idea is nevertheless useful to consider. And so, along these really positive exhibition experiences in my time at the Vancouver Art Gallery, that time was also marked by a lot of struggle, which came to a head when we went on strike in early 2019. In one of the most expensive cities in Canada to live in, the Vancouver Art Gallery has consistently failed to increase pay for its workers that, even come close to keeping up with inflation or to comparing with their colleagues in other institutions across the country. While at the same time, its director at the time was making over $350,000 and whose wage had increased 40% in just over 5 years. So this really blatant economic disparity was also accompanied by some serious mismanagement that sometimes fostered a pretty challenging work environment. Gallery staff were also heavily impacted by the pandemic. A few of my colleagues lost their jobs, and the rest of us moved to a 4-day work schedule. And in June of 2020, when Black Lives Matter protests were erupting across North America in response to George Floyd's murder, The Vancouver Art Gallery, as did a number of other institutions, put out a statement, which you see part of here on the screen, which was met with, which was understandably and reasonably met with calls for accountability, for the gallery to name the sort of tangible steps and actions that it was going to take, rather than the sort of statements of solidarity that most organizations were making. And later that same month, when Anthony Keendall's hire as the new director was announced, on the same day that this article was released in Canadian Art, it really, made that earlier Black Lives Matter statement ring hollow to many, as the whiteness of leadership in Canadian arts institutions was upheld. And I want to be clear that I understand this to be a systemic issue, and that I have a lot of respect for Anthony, and I think he's doing some really positive things at the Vancouver Art Gallery. He continued consultation and relationship building with the host nations that I and others had initiated, and is taking that in some really good directions. So while there hasn't been another senior curatorial fellow of Indigenous art, the gallery has hired Richard Hill as the curator of Canadian art. That's not exactly his title, but something similar to that. And I also really want to acknowledge my colleagues and the community at the Vancouver Art Gallery who have and really continue to work very hard for greater equity in that organization. How am I doing for time, Belinda? I have sort of 2 more slides that I can speak to.
We're at 10:35, so I think you're doing really well. You've got lots of time.
Okay, great. So I want to, I ran through the Vancouver Art Gallery strike and statements piece pretty quickly, but in sharing some resources and links, I'll share some articles, and the Art and Labor podcast did a great interview with curator Grant Arnold that you can listen to, that really sort of delve more into the specific dynamics that were happening at the gallery at the time. It was a really sort of compounding series of challenges at the gallery, some of which were really long-term and deep-seated, that have continuing implications. And it, something that I took away from that time was really very much how in our department, in Curatorial, everyone really, there was so much camaraderie among the staff to advocate for ourselves as workers, to have better working conditions on sort of multiple fronts, as well as to respond to calls from the public for the gallery to be more accountable in who it programs in its exhibitions, and what its relationships are with different cultural communities, that I think has produced some really positive outcomes. But I want to end by briefly talking about 2 Indigenous led organizations that are working toward greater institutional accountability and equity for Indigenous arts workers. The first is the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, which I have been involved with on the board since 2017, and I'm currently the co-chair. The ICCA has been around since 2006, first known as the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective, and it was established in response to a lack of opportunities for Indigenous curators. Creating opportunities for artists and curators is still very much part of what the organization does through its programming and partnerships. as well as supporting the advancement of critical discourse around Indigenous art practice and curatorial practice. In the last few years, however, we've also, the staff have been working to develop an institutional membership program that helps to support institutions who work with Indigenous people and to hold those partners accountable when needed. So there's, it's like a tiered membership system that also redistributes resources from non-Indigenous organizations to the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. And members gather for annual meetings to talk about issues and questions that they are dealing with. There's also an anti-colonial social club for Black, Indigenous, and POC staff members. And they have just now released this handbook with resources focused on addressing systemic inequities in institutions. So this handbook is available for members, but you can connect with the Curatorial Collective on similar programming. We're about to go into strategic planning this year and are really looking forward to sort of the next phase of this work that we're doing, which will include, I think, a focus on the issue of identity fraud that a lot of us are dealing with right now. And finally, I want to talk briefly about the Shishkateo Collective, which I am a member of alongside Jason Berg, Rianne Chartrand, Michelle Magot, Jamie Morse, as well as having a couple of contract staffers, Liz Barron, who is our general manager, and Ariane Muller, who is our researcher. So the collective was formed in 2020. The members of the collective are artists, curators, and educators working in universities and museums and art galleries. And came together to address the systemic inequities that Métis artists and arts workers face in the Canadian art system, as well as to cultivate the kinds of knowledge transfer and exchange that are needed for Métis arts and culture to flourish in a self-determined way. So we are currently on year 2 of a 3-year initiative funded by the Canada Council, which revolves around a few different components. One is gathering. So next month, we're about to have our first gathering in Winnipeg in conjunction with an exhibition that Sherry Farrell-Rissette and Kathy Mattis are curating at the Winnipeg Art Gallery called A Hard Birth, which is about the foundation of the province of Manitoba and the role that Métis and other people played in that. And we will then have subsequent gatherings here in Saskatoon at Ramey Modern this September, and finally at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa sometime in 2023. And those gatherings are really a space for Métis to Métis conversations to happen around what equity looks like for Métis arts workers, to talk about how we get there and how we want to address some of the major issues that we're facing. So it's both about, the collective really formed because we recognize that no one else is going to do this work for us. We all have, we have done some cursory research and all have a general understanding of the lack of Métis representation in collections across the country. as well as in opportunities like arts awards. Métis artists are also underrepresented in those areas. And so part of what this first 3-year initiative is aiming to do is to gather some more of that qualitative data that helps to build a foundation for further conversations with artists and arts workers about, what it is we need. We also are supporting a number of I call them activations, which is really just marshaling resources in support of work that people are already doing on the ground in the communities where they live, rather than, having Shishkateo come in from the outside and pretend to know what we know what should happen. Sorry. So we are working with the Mackenzie Art Gallery and the Mann Art Gallery to support programming coming up in June and later in the fall. So we're hoping to, through these activities, really sort of build a positive critical mass around Métis art and conversation about it. So we do have a website, and we're just really getting off the ground and trying to move deliberately and with a lot of thought and care. So our first gathering will be primarily between the members of the collective and our advisory, and we'll be focused on setting the direction for the collective over the next number of gatherings and the years to come. We are brought together to do this work by the need that we see in our field, rather than by any sort of personal, professional kinds of goals. So we're trying to also work with a long trajectory in mind, and thinking about how the Shishkateo needs to exist in the future to sort of continue this work. So I will conclude things there. I hope that some of the things that I've shared today maybe spark some ideas for folks that are listening. And yeah, I look forward to sharing some of those examples, as well as to having some further conversation now. So Marcy.
Thank you so much, Tarah. We're going to open up to audience questions now. I haven't got anything coming through yet, so I'm sure we'll give a few moments for people to think about that. If they have anything that they're wondering, would like you to elaborate on. Can you tell us what Shishkateo means?
Yeah, Shishkateo means a blaze in Michif. And we have named the first 3-year initiative that we're working on Manawewin, which means to hunt or to gather eggs, thinking about gathering those resources that we need around us for our sustenance, both sort of creatively and in terms of life itself. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask a question to start things off. I've written a few things down here, but I wanted to start with our organization. We've been thinking a lot. I think the pandemic has brought out a real awareness that the arts, not just visual arts, but many forms of art, there's a lot of competitiveness. It's very stressful and can be very unhealthy, especially the kind of power imbalance between artists and institutions like galleries or like funders like we are. So what do you have any thoughts on what we can do to sort of mitigate that and think more about health and wellness and accessibility in terms of how we operate?
I mean, I can again point to a couple of examples. the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, with partnership from Canada Council and one other organization whose name is escaping me at the moment. Imaginative was part of it, and there was someone else as well. Created the Community Cares program in 2020 in response to the pandemic, which was really trying in the most low barrier form to get money into artists' hands. So we had people submit I don't know, a 2-minute video talking about what care means to them and their work. And the contributors all received a fee for that of, I think, $1,000. And, the organization was really overwhelmed with the number of submissions that they received. And I think, is hoping to do something similar again in the near future. And I think, that example does really just speak to, it speaks to a couple of things. It speaks to the need to distribute resources quickly right now to artists. I think about how many artists had projects canceled or delayed. And, of course, that creates challenges for organizations. It's, at Ramey Modern, we're not scheduled very far in advance, or as far in advance as we would normally like to be. And that creates a lot of uncertainty and a need for flexibility and to approach projects in a very different way. But, that really, I think, kind of pales in comparison to what artists and independent creative folks have been experiencing during the pandemic. And that, as institutions, whether it's funders or, these institutions that employ people that have continued to have jobs throughout the pandemic, really need to think about how we can support artists in as low barrier a way as possible. And of course that, speaks to larger issues around models of funding. We can talk about, everything from the sort of standards of excellence, the excellence model, which of course is really problematic and very much operating from within that Western art world framework. And I think it's really vital, really critical for us to imagine what other modes granting can take. I know David Garneau wrote a really great article for Rung magazine about that. Talking about having community members nominate people because, there are cultural values within different Indigenous cultures that I guess prioritize is not the right word, but it's what's coming to mind, but prioritize a kind of humbleness, the monetary level of some of these grants is more money than people think that they should ask for sometimes, and of course, barriers around language and around professionalism. I think these are all things that we need to reconsider, both in terms of funding, but also just in terms of the professionalization of the arts more broadly. We need to think about what kinds of knowledges and experiences are valued.
Great. Well, the questions are coming in now, so that's good. Everyone had a chance to think. So we've got one here from Sandy Moore at the Art Gallery Regina. She said, it's nice to hear this as grounded in your personal experience with institutions and working with artists. Could you restate the source of something you quoted earlier in your presentation? Getting to know each other is an anti-colonial practice and can look a lot like friendship.
Yeah, so I learned that from Rania El Mugammer, who is an anti-oppression consultant and artist with Sudanese ancestry. And earlier this year, she did a couple of like workshops with staff and board members of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. So I will include her website in the resource links that we circulate, so that you can look her up.
Great, thanks. Did you want to read these, Tarah, or do you want me to read them? I'm happy. They seem to be addressed directly to you, so.
Sure, yeah, okay. Oscar. Oscar is the business manager at the Moose Jaw Cultural Center and is wondering if there's any chance to have some kind of collaboration with Shushkateo Collective. We have a visual art gallery at our facility. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Oscar. You can reach out to Shushkateo Collective if you Google us, and I'll just put our name in the chat. Our website is online, and you can get in touch with us through that, and we can have further conversation. Lovely to think about together.
We're getting quite a few questions a lot about the collective, so let's continue with those first.
Sure.
So Charlotte is asking, are you looking at First Nations or strictly Métis?
Primarily Métis, so that is the focus of our collective. In some of the programming that we're supporting, so for example, we're supporting the Radical Stitch Beading Symposium that is happening at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in June, which will involve, and our support is specifically around Métis artists attending and participating in that gathering. But the program itself includes Métis and First Nations, and I think it's really important to us to think about the kinships that we hold with our First Nations relatives. These distinctions are not so hard and fast, although we want to talk about Métis sovereignty as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Tarah. Colleen Charlotte is asking, how many languages have you included in your inclusion work?
I have in the exhibitions that I have curated, I've worked with a number of Indigenous languages. I wouldn't say that in any project I've been able to fully translate everything from English into another language. I think language has come in through the artists and sort of other collaborators that I've worked with, including people like CM Chief Bill Williams. But it's definitely, of course, such an important area for communicating how those worldviews are distinct. And in the work I'm doing with the Shushkateo Collective, language will be a big part of the focus of our gathering here in Saskatoon. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So Jara at Neutral Ground, she said you mentioned you're currently undergoing strategic planning with one of the orgs you're involved with. Can you speak a bit about what you've learned recently in regards to approaching the I think the strat planning probably from an anti-oppressive standpoint? That's kind of an open-ended question.
So we're not currently in strat planning. I've gone through strat planning with the ICCA once before in 2016, and also when I worked at Grant Gallery, I was involved with a kind of visioning process that led to the strat plan. And the Raimi Modern also has a new strat plan that was when I first joined in 2020. I sat in on a couple of consultation meetings, and as a member of the Mio Wakutuan staff committee, which is Indigenous staff group. We've offered some feedback on parts of the strategic plan and the work plan in conversation with the board. And so, across those 3 different organizations, very different kinds of conversations and processes, obviously. The 2016 strat plan process at the ICCA was really focused on Indigenous self-determination and what we call creative sovereignty. I don't think that that was an explicitly anti-oppression approach, and I think that that might come into our work more for this process because of the workshops that the staff and board have been doing, and also the programming thematic for this year for the ICCA is accountability. So anti-oppression is obviously important within that. Yeah, so I feel like the questions around self-determination and how we engage with communities that are often marginalized within these organizations is sort of the way that the conversation has been approached in my experience so far. Yeah.
So along that line, Tarah, some of your examples you showed us with your previous curating very much was considering, I think the artists and yourself were considering like the traditional institutional, I guess, spaces and where they were sitting geographically. So can you talk a little bit about how you mitigate that and what now you're working at the Ramey, you're thinking about in terms of that physical space and being located on the South Saskatchewan River. How are you finding that and what are some of can you give us an indication of new ideas or things you're going to be doing or have been doing?
Yeah, I have to say that I am like quite excited about the museum's new strat plan. There's 4 major goals that have been published on Ramey's website, which you can look at. And one of those goals is toward truth, reconciliation, and self-determination. A number of the leadership team at Ramey Modern are new to this community. The CEOs, Michelle Jakes, who's the head of exhibitions and collections, and myself, we've all sort of come to the city in the last like 18 months. It hasn't even been 2 years yet. So I think, and it's kind of nice to come with a group of like a whole group of new people because we are all in the process of building relationships from the ground up in that personal way, but we have the support of our colleagues who have been living and working here in the community and have some really deep connections. So, and like these things, they take time, and in the pandemic, even more so. So I'm very, although, we put up an exhibition within 8 months of me starting there, like very much still in a learning process, I would say. In terms of the strategic plan, though, we are like working toward involving the larger staff in creating something like a reconciliation action plan as a framework for responding to the calls to action that is grounded in the TRC's like naming of UN DRIP as the framework for reconciliation, which, as you know, is all about Indigenous self-determination. And I think self-determination is an area that that's really exciting to think about in the space of the museum in terms of what other kinds of models might need to be brought into play, because self-determination is about decision-making power, and that, you can quickly see how that differs from the hierarchical model that institutions operate in. But that is like certainly what the strat plan is about exploring. And so I'm really excited about that, and about the possibilities there. And also, that's a huge thing to think about, and isn't just about sort of internal processes, but it's also about relationships with communities here, and how their self-determination comes into conversation with the museum, and how the museum can support that. So that's something that I'm excited about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think, we're seeing great programming, the fireside talks, and now we can all go on Wednesdays if we don't have our memberships, which is great.
And bring your kids for free.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I mean that's another thing that is great. It's great to come to a museum where there is another Indigenous staff person in that kind of specific Indigenous role working. It's hard to be the only one, and there will be other positions that are coming up at the museum that will help to further bolster that work. So yeah, that's also exciting.
Great. So I don't see any other questions. I'll just give a little bit of comfortable silence here for people to.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the question that Felice asked, which was about whether we would be highlighting Métis artists on our website by adding links. I'm not sure that that kind of directory is necessarily the approach that we're going to take, but that is something that we're talking about. So please get in touch with us through our website and just let us know who you are and what you're about. We would love to know.
Great. Well, if we don't have any more questions,
That's Ramey Modern announced last week that the museum is now free admission for everyone under 18, and on Wednesdays it's by donation every Wednesday. So new sort of admissions model at the museum.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as we come to a close today, I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope you found the session interesting and both helpful and challenging to all your diversity and equity work, inclusion work that everybody is working on. I wanted to thank Jeff Smith for making these arrangements and running everything so seamlessly. And of course, to thank Tarah for being so generous with her time and her knowledge. Just a friendly reminder that our third seminar in our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion speaker series is Natalia Hunter-Young, a writer, film curator, and pre-doctoral fellow in Black Studies, who will speak about her current research, which considers the social and cultural impacts of social media videos documenting anti-Black police brutality through the interpretations of 3 Black visual artists. Natalia's session is scheduled for 10 a.m. on March the 24th. So you can register by sending an email to Jeff at gsmith@saskarts.ca.